The morning Ada Easton buried her husband, the sky above Harlow County, Kansas, was the color of a bruised purple and yellow, and wrong in every way a sky could be wrong. It was the spring of 1878, and the prairie stretched out around the Easton homestead like a great indifferent sea, grass bending low in the wind, as if it too were paying its respects to a man who had worked it half to death. Thomas Easton had been a good man. Not a brilliant one, not a poetic one, but a solid, decent man who had built a home with his hands and kept it warm through 3 brutal Kansas winters. He had died of a fever in the last week of March, quick and senseless as a candle blown out by a draft, leaving Ada at 31 years old with 2 children, 40 acres of unplanted wheat fields, a mule named Chester that hated everyone, and a debt to the grain merchant in town that would not wait for grief to finish its business. Ada did not weep at the graveside. She had already done that privately, in the dark of the bedroom where she had held Thomas's hand until it went cold. What she did at the graveside was stand straight, hold her son Eli's hand. He was 9 and trying his very hardest not to cry, his jaw set in a way that reminded her painfully of his father, and keep her other arm around her daughter Nora, who was 7, and did not fully understand what forever meant yet. Ada understood it completely. That was the burden she carried down the hill from the small cemetery plot behind the barn, the understanding of how long forever truly was. The weeks that followed were a particular kind of exhausting that went beyond the body. She rose before dawn, dressed herself and the children, fed the chickens and the mule and the 2 remaining pigs, hauled water from the well, made breakfast from what was left in the larder, sent Eli and Nora to the schoolhouse 2 miles down the road, and then stood alone in the middle of 40 acres of untouched earth and tried to calculate the impossible. The wheat had to be planted by the middle of May at the absolute latest, or the season would be lost. Lost meant the debt to Franklin Greer at the grain merchant would come due with nothing to pay it. Greer was not the sort of man who extended kindness or patience. He was the sort of man who had already come twice to the house since Thomas died, hat in hand and smile on his face, suggesting that perhaps the land itself might settle the debt if Ada found herself unable to manage. She had shown him the door both times with her chin up and her hands folded in front of her, perfectly composed, and then had gone behind the house and pressed her forehead against the rough wood siding until the feeling passed. She needed help. The knowing of it sat in her chest like a stone she could not cough up. Her nearest neighbor, old Warren Peck, was 64 years old, and his own fields kept him occupied from sunup to sundown. The men in town were all of them employed or otherwise occupied, and the ones who might have helped without strings attached were few and far between. She had no brothers. Her father was 3 states east and aging poorly. She was, in the most practical sense of the word, alone. It was on a Tuesday morning in the 2nd week of April that Henry Donovan rode onto her property. He came from the west, which meant he came out of the gold-pink light of early morning like something conjured, and Ada's first thought standing at the pump with her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned only halfway was that he was trouble. That was not an unfair assessment. He was tall in the saddle, broad through the shoulders, wearing a coat that had seen better years but was clean and well kept. His horse was a blood bay with good bone, a serious animal, and the man rode it the way men who had been riding since childhood rode, easy and completely without show. He had dark hair and several days of beard, and eyes the color of creek water, which was to say they could be brown or green depending on the light, and you could not quite pin them down. He looked to be somewhere in his mid-30s, maybe 34 or 35, the kind of age that had put experience into a face without making it old. He stopped at a respectful distance from the pump and touched the brim of his hat. "Morning, ma'am. I was wondering if you might have need of a hand." Ada straightened and set the pump handle down. "What sort of hand?" "Field work, mostly. I can plant, I can harvest, I can mend fence and do carpentry to a passable standard. I'm not looking for a long arrangement. I heard in town the Easton place might need some help for the season." There was nothing dishonest in his face, but Ada had lived long enough to know that honest faces were not guarantees. "Who told you that in town?" "The woman at the dry goods store, Mrs. Holt." She didn't offer it as gossip, she said it plainly, that a widow with 2 children and 40 acres was going to need a hand if the fields were going to get planted before the season turned. Margaret Holt. Ada would have to have a word with Margaret Holt, but even as she thought it, she recognized the impracticality of her own pride. Margaret was not wrong. The fields were going to need planting. "What do you charge?" "Room and board," he said. "Nothing else. I've been trailing cattle since February and I'm tired of sleeping on the ground. A dry place to sleep and meals, and I'll work honest for you." Ada studied him for a long moment. The morning birds were loud in the cottonwood by the fence. Chester the mule had appeared at the side of the barn and was staring at the newcomer with his usual expression of profound suspicion. "I have a barn," Ada said, "clean straw and a dry roof. I won't have you in the house. The barn is fine. I have 2 children. There are rules I keep in this house." "Yes, ma'am. And if I find you dishonest in any particular, you're gone that same hour." "That's fair," he said, and there was something in his voice that suggested he had been told as much before and had no quarrel with it. Ada dried her hands on her apron. "Ada Easton," she said. "Henry Donovan," he said, and swung down from the horse in a single fluid motion that Chester regarded with open hostility. She showed him the barn, the fields, the tool shed, and the particular cussedness of the mule in about 40 minutes. Henry Donovan listened to all of it without interrupting, which she appreciated. He asked 3 practical questions about the soil composition near the south field, examined the plow with the eye of a man who had used one, and noted without complaint that the harness needed mending before Chester could be put to work. By the time Ada went inside to start lunch, she had not yet decided whether she trusted him, but she had decided that he was competent, and competence at least was something she could work with. Eli came home from school that afternoon and spotted Henry in the south field walking the rows, and his eyes went wide in the particular way that 9-year-old boys' eyes go wide when something new and interesting has happened. He dropped his books on the porch steps and ran to the fence. Henry stopped walking and looked at him. "You're the new hand," Eli said. "That's right. My pa used to work those fields." Henry looked at the boy steadily. "He did a good job with them. The soil's well turned. He put work into this land." Eli stared at him for a moment, weighing something. "My name's Eli, Henry Donovan. Do you know how to use a pistol?" "Eli," Ada's voice came from the porch. "Come get your sister from next door." Eli gave Henry one more measuring look and then ran off. Henry watched him go, and Ada, watching from the porch, caught something in Henry's face, a kind of careful gentleness, the expression of a man who understood exactly how fragile that boy was right now and was handling the knowledge with both hands. Dinner that first night was a quiet, watchful affair. Ada set a plate for Henry on the back porch rather than at the kitchen table, which was the arrangement she had decided on, and he ate it there without complaint, and when he was finished, he brought the plate and cut back to the kitchen door and thanked her. Nora watched him from behind Ada's skirts with enormous dark eyes. He did not speak to Nora, just nodded at her very gently, and Nora watched him go back to the barn. "He's tall," Nora said. "He is," Ada agreed. "His horse is pretty. Go wash your hands for bed." The next morning Henry was up before Ada, which she discovered when she came downstairs at 4:30 to find the water barrel already full and the pump primed. She stood in her kitchen and looked at the full barrel for a moment, and something in her chest moved just slightly, the way a door moves when wind passes under it. She pushed the feeling down carefully and started the stove. April unfolded itself day by day. Henry mended the harness and hitched Chester to the plow, and the south field began to open up in long, dark furrows that smelled of iron and rain and something older than either. Chester, who had resisted every attempt Ada had made to work him since Thomas died, went along with Henry with a sullenness that was at least functional. Ada watched from the fence one morning as Henry stood in the field trying to convince Chester to move, and saw the exact moment. Henry said something low and direct to the mule that apparently satisfied whatever objection Chester had been nursing, because Chester moved. She never found out what he said. She planted the north quarter herself, on her knees with a dibble stick in the cold mornings while the children were at school, and Henry plowed and planted the rest. They worked in a comfortable parallel that required no negotiation, each understanding what needed doing and doing it. She fed him breakfast and dinner, and he worked without complaint from first light to dusk. It was toward the end of the second week that she first talked to him properly. Not the practical exchange of instructions and information that had characterized the first days, but a real conversation. It happened because of Nora. Nora had discovered Henry's horse. The blood bay, whose name turned out to be Copper, had the kind of patient warmth towards small children that some horses have, and Nora had taken to bringing the animal scraps of carrot and speaking to it at length about matters that were apparently confidential. Ada had allowed this because it kept Nora occupied in content, and because Copper did not seem to mind. On this particular evening, Ada came around the corner of the barn to collect Nora for bed and found her daughter standing on the bottom rail of the fence feeding Copper carefully, and describing in great detail the last birthday cake she had ever had, which had been her father's doing and had involved a considerable amount of molasses. Henry was sitting on the fence post 6 feet away, not speaking, just listening. He was turned slightly so that his face was in the late light, and he was watching Nora with an expression that Ada had no word for in that moment, something warm and private and a little sad, the expression of a man who was thinking about something precious that either he had lost or had never had. Ada stopped walking. Neither of them saw her. And the middle part was the best, Nora was telling the horse seriously, because that's where Papa put the extra syrup, and he said it was our secret, but Eli knew too because Eli always knows things. Copper lowered his head and lipped gently at Nora's palm. He sounds like he was a good father, Henry said quietly. Nora considered this. He sang off-key, she said. Mama always laughed at it, but she tried to hide the laughing. The best ones do. Ada walked back around the corner of the barn and pressed her back against the wood and stood there until her breathing was normal again. Then she walked back around, more noisily this time, and said it was time for bed, and Nora went without complaint, which was unusual and she suspected had something to do with Henry's unspoken presence being a settled, calm thing that had put a kind of peace into the evening. Later, after the children were in bed, she brought 2 cups of coffee out to the porch. Henry was sitting on the step and she set 1 cup beside him and sat in the chair above it. They watched the stars come out over the prairie for a while without speaking. "Where are you from?" she asked finally. "Missouri originally, grew up outside of Independence, a long way from here. I've been moving west for about 12 years, cattle drives mostly, Montana once, Texas a few times. You don't have a place of your own." It was not an accusation, just an observation, but he turned the coffee cup slowly in his hands before he answered. "No, I considered it, a couple of times. There was land available in Nebraska a few years back that I thought about. But it never came to the right moment." He paused. "What about you?" "Kansas always. Illinois first. I came west with Thomas in '72. He wanted the land. He talked about it for years." She paused. "He was right that it was good land. He just ran out of time." Henry said nothing to that because there was nothing useful to say, and she was grateful for the absence of empty words. They drank their coffee and listened to the coyotes far off in the dark. "You can stay until the harvest," she said then. It came out more formal than she'd intended. "That's July, late July if the weather holds. I'll pay you a fair wage once the grain is sold on top of the board." He looked up at her. The moonlight made his Creekwater eyes unreadable. "You don't have to pay wages, Mrs. Easton. I told you board was enough." "I keep fair accounts," she said. "That's the arrangement." He held her gaze for a moment, then nodded. "Until the harvest, then." She went inside and washed the cups and stood at the kitchen window looking out at the dark barn for a longer time than was strictly necessary before she went to bed. May came in with warmth and a week of steady rain. That was exactly what the newly planted wheat needed. Ada stood on the porch the first morning of it and watched the water come down in long silver lines and felt, for the first time since Thomas died, something that was not grief or fear or exhaustion. She could not name what it was. Relief, perhaps. A fragment of hope. The feeling of the season turning. Henry repaired the east fence that first week of rain, working in it with a coat on, and his hat brim turned down, and fixed 2 boards on the barn roof that had been threatening to give since winter, and rebuilt the top step of the porch that had been soft and treacherous for months. Ada watched him do these things and added them to the silent ledger she kept in her head, the one that was labeled not wages but something more complicated, the register of a person proving themselves trustworthy action by action, day by day. Eli had decided, with the pragmatic openness of 9-year-old boys, that Henry was worth knowing. He began appearing in the barn on Saturday mornings with questions. First about horses, how to read the angle of a horse's ears, how to check a hoof properly, what colic was and how to treat it. Henry answered everything directly and without condescension, which Eli seemed to receive as a form of respect. Then the questions expanded. How did you steer a cattle herd? What did Montana look like? Had Henry ever been in a gunfight? That last question Ada heard from the kitchen window and she waited. I've had guns pointed at me, Henry said from inside the barn. And I've pointed mine at others. I've never fired at a man and I've never been shot. I'd like to keep it that way on both ends. Did you want to? Eli pressed. Shoot anyone. A pause. There were moments where I was angry enough. Fear and anger together can make you want to do things that aren't right. But wanting a thing and doing it are different, and the space between them is where character lives. Silence from Eli. Then, my papa never had a gun. Some men don't need them. He wasn't scared of things. He just didn't think guns solved much. He was probably right more often than he was wrong, Henry said. Ada turned from the window and went back to her bread, and her hands on the dough were steadier than usual, kneading with a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. The spring social in town fell on the 3rd Saturday of May, and Mrs. Holt, who had been the one to send Henry to the Easton farm, and who considered herself thereby responsible for the subsequent functioning of the household, appeared at Ada's door that Friday morning with a determined expression and a casserole dish. You are going to the social tomorrow, Margaret Holt said, stepping inside without being fully invited in the way of old friends. You have not left this property except for church in 6 weeks, and you are going to talk to people and eat food you did not cook yourself and breathe air that does not smell of wheat and worry. Ada opened her mouth. No, Margaret said. Ada closed her mouth. I will watch the children. You will wear the blue dress. It's decided. The blue dress was the best dress Ada had, deep indigo with ivory buttons, and it had been in the cedar chest since Thomas's funeral. She took it out the night before and pressed it and hung it by the window and stood looking at it for a while with a complicated feeling she could not put a name to. Henry was at the pump the next morning when she came out ready to take the wagon to town. He was not going to the social. He had not been invited, and she had not thought to think about it. And he was in his work clothes with his sleeves rolled up, and when he saw her in the blue dress he stopped pumping. The silence lasted maybe 2 seconds, but Ada noticed it. I'm going into town, she said, in case the dress needed explaining. Yes, ma'am, he said, and then, after a pause, you look well. She had been complimented before. Thomas had said she was lovely so many times it had become comfortable, worn and familiar as a good coat. But those 2 words from Henry, you look well, said in a voice that suggested he was simply reporting an observation he had not entirely intended to make, were different in a way she spent the entire drive to town not thinking about. The social was held in the Grange Hall, long tables of food, and a fiddle player named Carson Briggs who played with more enthusiasm than accuracy, but who made up for it in volume. Ada drank punch and talked to women she knew, and nodded at men who tipped their hats and watched their children run between the tables with the temporary wildness of children let out of routine. She was fine. She smiled and spoke and participated in the ordinary business of community life. And underneath it all there was the constant low hum of awareness that she was doing it alone, that the space beside her where Thomas had always stood was empty, and that people noticed the emptiness with the particular kind of careful pity that was worse than unkindness. Franklin Greer appeared at her elbow somewhere near the end of the evening with his hat in his hand and his smile as smooth and managed as always. He was 50-something, prosperous, twice a widower himself, and the way he looked at her had an assessment in it that she had never quite liked. "Mrs. Easton, you look lovely this evening." "Mr. Greer, I've been meaning to speak with you about the account. I understand you've brought on some help for the fields." "I have." "Good thinking." He paused. "If the harvest comes in well, I imagine we can settle things cleanly. If it doesn't, well, I want you to know that I would always be willing to discuss other arrangements. The land is valuable and I'm not without options for the harvest will come in well," Ada said. Her voice was pleasant, completely level and iron-clear underneath. "Good evening, Mr. Greer." She drove home in the dark with the stars enormous overhead and the prairie singing its low night song of wind and crickets, and she felt in the wake of that conversation a sharp and clarifying anger that was more useful than sadness. She would not lose this land. Thomas had given too much of his life to it. She would plant it and harvest it and pay what was owed and keep what was hers, and nobody, not Greer with his smooth assessments, not the weather, not anything was going to take it from her. The light was still on in the barn when she pulled in. She unhitched the horse herself rather than waking Henry, but he came out anyway, having heard the wagon, and took the horse's head without comment and walked it to the stall. Ada stood in the warm darkness of the barn holding the harness. "Long evening?" he asked from the stall. Long enough. She paused. Greer was there. Henry came back from the stall and stood a few feet from her. The single lantern threw shadows long and warm across the hay and the walls. What did he want? "To remind me that my options are limited." She hung the harness on its peg. "He's been watching this land for a while. He'd take it if I gave him the excuse." "You won't." It was said so plainly, so without doubt, that she looked up at him. He was leaning against the stall door with his arms crossed, looking at her with those changeable eyes that the lantern light had turned to amber. "You don't know that," she said. "I've watched you work for 5 weeks," he said. "I know that." The words settled over her like something warm, and she was suddenly aware of the smallness of the barn and the late hour, and the way the lantern light made everything intimate and close. She looked down at the harness. "Good night, Mr. Donovan," she said. "Good night, Mrs. Easton." She went inside and took off the blue dress and hung it carefully and lay in bed with her eyes open, listening to the wind until sleep took her. June arrived with its full weight of green and heat, and the wheat came up in long, even rows that caught the morning light and ran with it like water. Ada walked the fields every morning before the children woke, checking the growth, and the first time she saw the full south field standing knee-high and healthy and moving in the early wind, she put her hand over her mouth. It was not grief this time. It was something close to joy, which was a feeling she had somewhat forgotten was available to her. Henry found something to fix every day. There was always something. The smokehouse chimney needed repointing. The chicken coop needed a new door. The well housing had a wobble that had been there since winter. He worked with a focused, unhurried competence that Ada found herself, as the weeks went on, watching when she thought he wasn't looking. He was not a man who performed his work. He simply did it, and then moved to the next thing, and there was a quiet industry about him that she found, she admitted to herself one morning, genuinely attractive. That admission alarmed her, and she went and made an unusually complicated jam just to have something to do with her hands. The middle of June brought a heat that turned the air to white and made the children cross, and sent Chester into a prolonged bad temper that expressed itself as a refusal to move in any direction for 24 hours. Ada and Henry spent one afternoon in the tool shed sorting seeds for the kitchen garden, side by side in the relative cool of the shade, and for the first time since he arrived, they talked easily and at length about things that had nothing to do with the farm. She told him about Illinois, about her father's hardware store and the smell of metal and wood shavings, about the summer she was 12 when the river flooded, and the whole town spent a week in the second stories of their houses, and it had felt, to 12-year-old Ada, like the most extraordinary adventure. He told her about the Montana cattle drive of 1873, the Yellowstone country and the wild cold of it, the way the mountains came up so fast out of the plain that you couldn't believe they were real. He described them with a specific, remembered reverence, the words of a man who had seen a beautiful thing and was still carrying it. "Do you miss it?" she asked. "The moving around." He sorted a handful of bean seeds slowly. "I miss some of it, the country itself, the feeling of going towards something." He paused. "I don't miss not having anywhere to come back to." She looked at her hands in her lap. "Thomas used to say that home wasn't a place, that it was whoever was holding the lantern when you got back." Henry was quiet for a moment. "That's true," he said. Something passed between them in that quiet, not a declaration, not even quite an acknowledgement, more like a glance between two people who have been pretending not to see the same thing, and then it passed, and Ada picked up the next batch of seeds, and they worked in silence until the light changed and it was time to start supper. On the last Saturday in June, the town of Harlow had a situation that reached the Easton property on the wings of gossip before the afternoon was out. 3 men passing through had caused trouble at the saloon, nothing lethal, but enough broken furniture and raised voices to bring out the town marshal. The marshal, a decent man named Boyle who was getting on in years, had handled it, but the incident stirred up the particular kind of uneasy talk that ran through small prairie towns like water through cracks, the sense of a thin line between order and its absence. Eli heard about it at church Sunday morning and came home burning with the drama of it. Henry listened to Eli's account seriously, without either dismissing it or amplifying it, asked a few practical questions about what the marshal had done and whether anyone had been hurt, and when Eli ran out of story said simply, "Marshal Boyle handled it, that's what law is for," which deflated Eli's excitement slightly but in a way that seemed, watching it, instructive rather than disappointing. After Eli went inside, Ada said quietly, "Thank you for that." Henry looked at her. "Boys that age want the violence to be interesting," he said. "It usually isn't. It's usually just stupid and costly." She wanted to ask him more about the years on the trail, about what he had seen, about what had made him the man who said those things to a 9-year-old boy as if they were obvious and important at once. But she did not ask, because the asking would have required a kind of openness she had not yet arrived at. July came like a hammer. The wheat in the south field was shoulder-high and golden-headed, and the air smelled of grain dust and heat, and the specific sweetness of a crop that was going to come in well. Ada stood at the fence in the early morning and felt her heartbeat in her throat. This was it. This was what Thomas had planted 4 years of his life toward, and it was real and it was golden and it was hers. Henry came to stand beside her at the fence. She heard his boots in the dry grass, felt him settle next to her, a foot of space between them. "End of the month," he said. "Yes. Maybe sooner if the heat holds." "Yes." She was aware in the morning warmth and the smell of the grain and the sideways gold of the early light that he was leaving. That was the arrangement. Until the harvest. Those were the words she had said and he had agreed to, and she had meant them sensibly, practically, as the natural limit of a practical arrangement. She had not accounted for the fact that 5 months was long enough for things to grow that you hadn't planned on. She turned to go back inside and he said, "Ada." She stopped. It was the first time he had used her first name without the Mrs. Easton, and her pulse did something complicated. "There's a loose board in the hayloft," he said. "I wanted to let you know before I fix it if you hear hammering above your head this morning." "Thank you," she said. Her voice was perfectly ordinary. She went inside. She stood in the kitchen and put both hands flat on the table and breathed in through her nose and out through her mouth the way she had learned to do when something was too large to manage all at once. The harvest came on the 22nd of July, 2 days earlier than she had predicted. She woke to a morning so blue and clear it was almost painful and went out to find Henry already in the field. And she went back inside and made the largest breakfast she had ever made, and sent the children to old Warren Peck for the day, and went out herself with her sleeves rolled and her hair in a braid, and worked beside Henry from morning to evening in the hot, honest labor of bringing in the wheat. It was not glamorous work. It was sweat and chaff in the back of your throat and arms that burned, and the constant bend-and-dries of cutting grain with a cradle scythe, and the raking and binding, and the hauling. And by the time the sun started down the sky they had brought in the south field and half the north quarter, and neither of them could straighten all the way. They stood at the edge of the field in the long amber evening light, covered in dust and chaff and the honest wreckage of a day's hard labor, and looked at what they had done. "Good harvest," Henry said. "Yes," Ada said. "It is." The grain was bound and stooked in the field, and the air smelled of it, warm and sweet and full. Ada had the particular feeling that she imagined soldiers must have at the end of a long fought, and finally won campaign, the specific exhaustion that contains beneath it the architecture of victory. She turned to Henry and said, "Thank you." He looked at her. The light was doing extraordinary things to his face in that moment, the late July evening light that made everything in Kansas look like something out of a painting, warm and lit from the side so that every feature was clearly drawn. "I'm glad I stayed," he said. The weight of those 3 words, "I'm glad I stayed." Not just for the work. She knew it was not just for the work, and he knew she knew it. "Henry," she said, and then stopped because she did not have a sentence ready, just his name, which she had been not saying for 2 months. "I know it was the agreement," he said. His voice was careful. "Until the harvest, I'll honor that." "I know you will," she paused, "but you don't have to." The quiet between them was enormous and alive. "Ada," he said, very low. She was 31 years old, and she had buried a husband 4 months ago, and she was covered in wheat dust and her arms hurt, and she was standing in a field that she had just brought back from the edge of ruin, and the man in front of her was looking at her with creekwater eyes that had gone very still, and she found that she was not frightened by any of it. "There's still the north field," she said. "Another 2 days at least." A slow, careful, real smile crossed his face. "There is," he agreed. "And the smokehouse chimney's only half done." "It is, so you might as well stay." "I might," he said, "at least a while longer." They walked back to the farmhouse side by side in the fading light, not touching, with the same foot of space between them that there had always been, and it felt different now. The space between them was not distance anymore. It was just the small amount of air that exists between 2 people who are about to close it. She made dinner and they ate together on the porch, all 4 of them, Ada and Henry and Eli, and Nora, which was not the arrangement she had kept, him on the back step, her and the children at the table. But on harvest night it seemed wrong to make him eat alone, and she said so simply, and he came and sat at the table, and Nora showed him the drawing she had made of copper, and Eli asked 16 questions about cattle branding. And Ada watched the table she sat at become a different thing than it had been, something fuller, something that hummed with the ordinary warmth of people gathered together at the end of a hard and well-worked day. After the children were in bed, they sat on the front porch. The stars were astonishing. They almost always were in Kansas in July, the dark so wide and the air so clear that the sky looked like a field of its own, planted with more light than you could count. Ada had a glass of cold water and Henry had a cup of coffee, and they sat in their respective chairs, and the coyotes called from somewhere south. "What would you have done," she asked, "if you hadn't come here?" He thought about it. "Gone north. I had a vague idea of Cheyenne territory. Maybe find work at one of the larger ranches." He paused. "I'm glad I came here instead." She was quiet for a moment. "Henry, I want to say something honestly." He turned his chair slightly, giving her his full attention without making it into a performance. "I was not looking for anything," she said. "When you rode in April, I was looking for a hand, nothing more. I want you to know that. I know that. And I want you to know that what I feel now is, it surprises me." She said it carefully and directly, because she was a woman who had always been more at ease with honesty than with implication. I was not expecting it, and I haven't been sure what to do with it. He was quiet for a long moment, and the silence was not uncomfortable. It was the silence of a man who was taking what had been said seriously rather than rushing to answer it. I wasn't expecting it either, he said. I wasn't looking for anything when I came here. I was tired and I needed to stop moving for a while, and that's all I thought it was. He paused. It turned out to be more. Yes, she said. I don't want to complicate your life, Ada. You have the children and you have this land and you've built something real here. I don't want to walk in and disrupt it. You've been here for 5 months, she said. You haven't disrupted it. You've added to it. He held her gaze across the dark porch. I've been on the road a long time. I don't know that I'm easy to live with. I don't know that I am either, she said. I'm stubborn and I keep my own accounts and I don't like being managed. I know all 3 of those things. And I'm not interested in managing you. The words were so simple and so exactly right that she felt them land somewhere deep and warm in the place where Thomas's voice used to live, not replacing it, but settling beside it like a new flame beside a remembered one. I'm not asking you to make any declaration tonight, she said. We've both got more sense than that. She paused. I'm just saying, don't go because the harvest is done. Stay a while longer if you want to. He held her gaze and said, I want to. She nodded and finished her water and said good night, and went inside. And this time when she stood at the kitchen window looking out at the barn, she was smiling. August deepened and the farm found a rhythm that incorporated Henry fully and naturally, as if the frame of it had always had a space his shape. He took the grain to Greer's in town with the wagon in the first week of the month, and Ada came with him, and the transaction was done in the clean, plain language of settled accounts. Greer counted the money and Ada accepted it without expression, and the debt was cleared. And when they walked out of the grain merchants into the bright August street, Ada inhaled slowly and let it out and felt 20 pounds lighter. Henry glanced at her as they went to the wagon. All right, completely, she said. And then, because she felt like it and the street was not too busy, I want pie. He laughed. It was the first full laugh she had heard from him, unguarded and real, and it was a good laugh, warm and genuine, and it did something to her face that she couldn't stop. They had pie at the Harlow Inn restaurant, which was a modest establishment with good lemon pie, and a waitress named Delia who had known Ada since before Thomas died and who looked at Henry, and then at Ada with the sort of contained delight that close friends are terrible at suppressing. New friend, Delia said, in a voice pitched only slightly above necessary. Mr. Donovan works on the farm, Ada said. I see, said Delia, in the tone of a woman who saw considerably more than the surface of a thing. Henry ate his pie and said nothing, and had the grace not to smile, which Ada appreciated. Walking back to the wagon, Henry stopped at the window of the general store where a display of seed packets had been arranged. He looked at them for a moment, then went inside. Ada waited, and after a few minutes he came out with a small brown paper packet. What's that? She asked. He turned it over in his hands. Lavender, he said. For the kitchen garden if you want it. It comes back every year. She took the packet from him. The paper was warm from his hands. Lavender, a perennial. Something you planted once and that came back every year after, reliably, without asking, committed to the ground in a way that seasonal crops were not. She looked at him over the packet. He was looking at her with the measured, honest openness that she had come to understand was how he expressed the things he was not yet saying aloud. She put the packet in her basket. Thank you, she said. They drove home through the August afternoon with the golden Kansas countryside rolling out around them, and the conversation was easy and wide-ranging and punctuated by comfortable silences. And at some point between 1 mile and the next, without either of them marking when it happened, their shoulders were touching on the wagon bench. Neither of them moved apart. September brought the first cool edges into the mornings, the blue-gold chill that followed the blaze of August like a long breath after exertion. Ada planted the lavender along the south wall of the house, where it would get the winter sun, and Henry built a proper cold frame for the kitchen garden vegetables, and Eli started the new school year and came home full of things he had learned and needed to report at dinner. The dinner table had definitively become a shared table by now. There was no back step, no back porch arrangement anymore. Henry sat at Thomas's old chair, which had happened incrementally and without announcement, and which Ada had allowed with full awareness of what she was allowing. Eli had adopted the habit of saving the most important piece of information from school each day to tell Henry specifically, some fact or event or problem that required Henry's particular consideration, and Henry always gave it. Nora had drawn 3 separate portraits of Copper and presented them to Henry with the gravitas of an artist presenting work to a patron. It was warm and it was good, and Ada was aware, lying awake in September nights with the window cracked to let in the cool air, that she was happy in a way she had not been for a long time. A different shape of happiness from the kind she had had with Thomas, not better or worse but different, newer, still being discovered at its edges. She also had moments of guilt about this, in the way that widows do, and she worked through them with the same directness she applied to everything else. She had loved Thomas. She would always love Thomas, in the past tense permanent way you love people who are gone. But love did not work on the principle of scarcity, of one vessel, of one person allowed in a lifetime. Her heart was not diminished by what it had held before. It was, if anything, larger for it. She and Henry had their first argument in the second week of September, which was both inevitable and clarifying. It was over the roof of the barn. Henry had found additional rot in the east side, and his assessment was that it needed to be fully replaced before winter. Ada's assessment was that partial repair and heavy tar paper would see it through another season, because a full replacement was expensive, and the harvest money, while sufficient to clear the debt, was not lavish after that. Henry said the partial repair would not hold through a hard winter, and they would end up paying more in the spring. Ada said she knew her own budget better than he did. Henry said the budget was not relevant if the barn collapsed on the animals in February. They stood in the barn arguing about it in plain, direct terms for about 10 minutes, neither of them raising their voices but neither of them yielding, and then Ada said, "I'll make the decision because it's my barn," and Henry said, "Yes, it is," and went out. She felt the familiar rigidity of standing her ground, and also, after it, the familiar secondary feeling of wondering whether the ground she had stood was actually solid. She sat with both feelings for a day and looked at the barn roof figures Henry had written up and done the sums again more carefully, and then went to the barn the following morning and said, "You're right about the roof." He stopped what he was working on and looked at her. "I'm not easy to argue with," she said. "No," he agreed, "but you're fair when you've had time to look at it properly." "I'll order the timber," he nodded. "I'll start pulling the old boards next week." She turned to go and then turned back. "Henry, do you mind it, my stubbornness?" He looked at her for a moment, and there was something in his eyes that was so frank and so warm that she felt it across the 10 feet of barn between them. "No," he said, "I don't mind it at all. It's part of how you kept this place standing." She went back to the house and stood in the kitchen for a moment with her hand on the counter, feeling the solid wood under her palm, and the solid ground under the house, and the solid Kansas sky outside the window, and the solid and particular feeling of being known. The barn roof was replaced in the last week of September, and Henry pulled boards and Ada handed up the new ones, and Eli was allowed to hammer certain non-critical nails under Henry's supervision. And by Friday evening the east side of the barn roof was new and tight and properly pitched for rain and snow, and Ada looked at it with the satisfaction of a problem correctly solved. That evening Henry found her in the kitchen garden, turning the soil around the lavender seedlings in the last of the evening light. The plants were small but established, dark green and fragrant, and Ada was on her knees in the dirt with her hands moving gently around the roots. Henry crouched beside her. "They're taking well," he said. She looked at the small plants. "They are, A pause. "They'll come back in the spring." "Every year after," he said quietly. She looked at him. He was close in the dusk, close enough that she could see the specific shade his eyes were in, this light warm brown with green in the depths, lit from the side by the last gold of the evening. His hands were on his knees, and he was looking at her with an expression she had no more reason to interpret carefully because she understood it completely. "Henry," she said. "Ada," he said. And then, because 5 months of restrained and careful, an honest growing toward each other had arrived at a moment where restraint would have been its own kind of dishonesty, she reached out and put her hand over his where it rested on his knee, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they stayed like that in the kitchen garden in the October almost evening with the lavender between them, and nothing else needed to be said. October arrived in full color, the cottonwoods along the creek going gold and the mornings sharp with the clean bite of coming winter, and Henry Donovan did not leave. He was not a temporary hand anymore, and both of them knew it, and the farm and the household quietly incorporated this knowledge in the way that life does when things settle where they belong. He moved from the barn to the small room off the kitchen that had been a storage room since Thomas died, a proper room with a cot and a window and a shelf, because the barn was no longer a sensible arrangement now that the nights were cold, and because Ada had offered it and he had accepted, and the arrangement was proper and observed all the right forms, which mattered in a small town, and Ada was clear-eyed about that. Margaret Holt visited one Saturday morning ostensibly to bring a jar of preserved peaches and transparently to observe developments, and found Ada and Henry reorganizing the root cellar together with the cheerful efficiency of two people who had been working alongside each other for months. Margaret sat in the kitchen and drank tea and watched Ada through the open cellar door with the expression of a woman having all of her theories confirmed, and when she left she pressed Ada's hand and said simply, "Thomas would be glad," and Ada had to blink several times quickly and then was fine. The children had adjusted with the practical acceptance of children who understand, even without being told everything, that the people around them are happier. Eli had developed what could only be described as a mentorship relationship with Henry, following him around on weekends and absorbing information about horses, farming, and the mechanics of various tools with an appetite that Henry fed patiently, and without ever making Eli feel that the questions were too many. Nora had decided some weeks ago that Henry belonged in the family portrait she was drawing of all of them. Ada had found it one evening on the kitchen table, 4 stick figures, and Nora had labeled them Mama, me, Eli, and Henry, and had spent a considerable amount of time on Henry's hat. Ada had kept that drawing. It was in the middle drawer of the kitchen dresser, folded once, and she thought about it more than she let herself examine. One evening in the middle of October, Henry came in from working in the cold and sat at the kitchen table while Ada cooked and said, "I want to talk to you about something." She stirred the pot and waited. "I've been thinking about what comes next," he said. "For the farm and for all of it," he paused. "I'd like to make the arrangement permanent, Ada, if you'll have me, not just as a hand, as a partner, in the proper sense." She set the spoon down. The kitchen was warm and smelled of rosemary, and the fire was burning steady, and the children were in the other room, and the Kansas night was pressing blue and cold against the windows. She turned to look at him. He was sitting with his hands on the table, not performing ease but genuinely steady, a man who had said what he meant and was waiting. "Is that a proposal?" she asked. "Yes," he said. "It is." She looked at him for a long moment, at the creekwater eyes and the work-roughened hands and the barn-roof timber and the lavender seeds, and every morning for 5 months from the pump barrel filled before she came downstairs, all of it, the accumulated weight of a person proving themselves true. "Yes," she said, "it is." He let out a slow breath, and she realized he had been more afraid of the answer than he had shown, and something in that vulnerability, in the proof that it mattered so much to him, made her cross the kitchen and put her arms around him from behind where he sat, and he put his hands over her arms, and they stayed like that in the warm kitchen while the pot simmered and the fire crackled, and the night did its blue-cold business outside. They were married on the 15th of November, 1878, in the Methodist Church in Harlow, in a ceremony presided over by Reverend Alcott, who was a thin, quiet man with good reading glasses and a kind heart. It was a small gathering: Margaret Holt, Warren Peck, the Holt family, a handful of Ada's friends from church, and the children, who were respectively excited Nora and thoughtfully serious Eli. Ada wore the blue dress again, and Henry wore his best shirt, which was clean and well-pressed, and which Ada had ironed herself that morning, and they stood in front of the congregation in the November light that came through the church windows in long pale columns, and said the words that made the arrangement permanent. After the ceremony, Margaret Holt organized a small supper at her house that turned into a genuine celebration, with Carson Briggs and his enthusiastic fiddle and dancing between the tables, and Ada danced with her husband, the strangeness and rightness of those two words together. In the middle of the Holt parlor, while Nora danced with Warren Peck on his creaking knees, and Eli consented to one dance with a girl from his school, with the expression of someone performing a necessary diplomatic mission. Henry was not an expressive dancer, but he was a good one, and Ada found herself laughing at something he said close to her ear, and the laugh felt like the most natural thing in the world, and she was aware in that moment of being fully, presently, completely happy. Not the waiting for something good happiness, not the remembering something good happiness, but the here it is, right now happiness that is the rarest kind. They drove home in the late November dark with Nora asleep against Henry's shoulder on the wagon bench and Eli drooping beside Ada, and the stars were out in their full prairie abundance, and Henry had his arm around Nora without even thinking about it. The automatic protectiveness of a man who had already become what the word would now, officially, be. The winter of 1878 into 1879 was the first one Ada had not been frightened of since Thomas died. The barn roof held beautifully through the first snow, which Henry greeted with something that might have been smugness if it had not been so entirely warranted. The root cellar was well stocked. The cold frame Henry had built protected the winter vegetables through everything the Kansas January threw at them. The house was warm. They spent the long evenings reading and talking and playing games with the children, and when the children were in bed, they sat by the fire together, Ada with her mending or her accounts, and Henry with whatever book he was working through. He was a serious reader, which had surprised her pleasantly, and the quiet between them had the texture of something good, full and easy and entirely at rest. They talked about the farm's future in those evenings, making plans with the calm practicality of two people who had both worked hard and thought clearly about what they were building. Henry had an idea about adding a second field rotation to rebuild the soil nutrients, a technique he had heard of from a farmer in Missouri who had studied it from Eastern agricultural journals. Ada had been thinking about expanding the chicken operation, which could provide income in the off-season from egg sales in town. They argued about timing and sequencing, and costs with the productive friction of two minds that worked differently and well together, and the plans grew into a shape that felt solid. In January, Henry adopted Chester officially. This was more of a philosophical position than a legal one, but it expressed itself in Henry spending 45 minutes in the cold barn on a Tuesday evening having what appeared to be a very frank conversation with the mule, after which Chester demonstrated a new and unprecedented willingness to be led without incident. Ada watched this through the barn window and shook her head. "What do you say to him?" she asked later. "I tell him the truth," Henry said. "What truth? That he's being difficult for no reason and it doesn't serve him. And that works. Apparently Chester finds honesty refreshing." She laughed, and he smiled, and the kitchen was warm. Spring came to the Kansas prairie in March of 1879, with the exuberant chaos it always brought, mud and wind and the first green shoots pushing through the bare soil, and with it came two pieces of news that arrived in the same week with the impact of stones dropped into still water. The first was that Ada was expecting. She told Henry on a Wednesday morning, standing in the kitchen with both hands around her coffee cup, and watched his face go through a sequence of expressions: surprise, then a kind of internal stillness, then something so warm and open that she felt it like sunlight. He stood and came to her and took the coffee cup very gently out of her hands and set it on the table, and then held her face in both his hands and looked at her with his full attention in the way he had that left no part of her unwatched and unknown, and said, "Are you well?" "Very well," she said. He folded her carefully into his arms, and she pressed her face against his shoulder and felt his heartbeat, steady as the earth. And neither of them spoke for a long time because there was nothing that needed to be said. The second piece of news was that Franklin Greer had sold his grain merchant business and was leaving Harlow County for Denver, having decided that the city offered better prospects. Ada heard this from Margaret Holt, who delivered it with considerable satisfaction, and Ada stood in Margaret's kitchen and felt the last thread of anxiety she had been carrying about that particular chapter of her life quietly release. Eli took the news of the baby with the slightly overwhelmed solemnity of a boy who was computing what this meant for his position in the household. Henry talked to him privately about it one Saturday, and whatever was said, Eli came back from that conversation with his jaw set in the way he had. That meant he had made a decision about something. And from that point forward, he took a distinct and proprietary interest in the preparations with the attitude of an older brother who had decided this was his project too. Nora's response was to immediately begin drawing the new baby in every picture she made. Even before the baby had arrived, a small bundled figure with enormous eyes who featured in scenes of barn life, kitchen life, and one ambitious composition depicting the family at harvest time that Ada found so unexpectedly moving she kept it in the same drawer as the first family portrait. The spring planting of 1879 was different from the year before in every way that mattered. There were two of them working at this time, not the anxious necessity of a widow calculating impossible odds, but the easy collaboration of a man and woman who knew each other's working rhythm and trusted each other completely. Henry handled the heavier plowing, and Ada managed the seed calculations, and the kitchen garden, and the expanding chicken operation. And Eli was old enough now to be genuinely useful with the lighter field work on Saturday mornings, which he undertook with a seriousness that Henry rewarded with more responsibility and real instruction. The lavender along the south wall of the house had come through the winter exactly as it should, as perennials do, as things committed to the ground come back, reliably, every year. And in the April warmth it was pushing up new shoots, dark green and already fragrant, and Ada touched it in passing every morning when she went by, the soft press of her fingers against the leaves releasing the small, clean fragrance into the air. Henry found her doing it one morning and came to stand beside her, looking at the plants. "You planted something that came back," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, her hands still warm with lavender. "I planted several things," he said quietly, and she understood he meant all of it: the wheat, the lavender, the family, the life. And she turned her face into his shoulder and held on. The baby came in September of 1879, a boy, which pleased Eli enormously in ways he tried to conceal behind maturity. They named him James Thomas Donovan Thomas for Ada's first husband, because Thomas had loved this land and built this house and deserved to be carried forward, and James for Henry's father, a farmer in Missouri who had died when Henry was 19, and whom he spoke of with the specific careful love of a son who was still learning what he had inherited. Henry held James in the lamplight of the bedroom on the night he was born, and Ada watched her husband's face and saw in it everything she needed to see. The man who had ridden in from the West in April of 1878 and the man he had become by September of 1879 were the same man and also entirely different. the way a planted field is the same soil and completely transformed. He has your nose, Henry said. He has your chin, Ada said. That's an unfortunate inheritance. I think it's a very fine chin. Henry looked up from the baby and smiled at her, the full, unguarded smile, the one she had first heard in the restaurant in August of 1878 before she had ever seen it, and she thought it was still the best thing she had seen, now that she knew the whole person it belonged to. The harvest of 1879 came in even better than the year before. The soil rotation Henry had planned was already showing effects in the south field, the yield per acre up noticeably, and Ada noted the numbers in the farm ledger with the satisfaction of a woman whose accounts were in perfect order. The barn roof was sound. The chickens were productive. The kitchen garden had supplied them well through the summer, and the root cellar was packed to capacity. The debt to Greer was a year and a half in the past, and in its place was a small but genuine surplus in the bank at Harlow, the first Ada had ever had. She showed Henry the ledger that evening, running her finger down the column of figures, and he looked at them and then at her. "You built this," he said. "We built this," she said. He shook his head once. "You kept this land through the worst year of your life with 2 children and a mule who hated everyone. I showed up in April. You showed up when I needed someone to show up," she said, "and you stayed." He looked at her for a long moment and then said, "Ada, I would stay every year, for every harvest, for every difficulty, for every good thing and every hard thing. I just want you to know that." She closed the ledger and put her hand over his and said, "I know that. I have known it for a long time." The years that followed settled into the shape of a life well lived, which is to say they were full of ordinary days punctuated by moments of great significance. And the ordinary days were themselves full of quiet joy that didn't announce itself, but accumulated like the grain in the cellar, layer by layer into something substantial. Eli grew tall through 1880 and 1881 with a speed that seemed to surprise even himself, and his interest in the farm deepened from the curiosity of a boy into the genuine engagement of a young man learning a craft. Henry taught him everything he knew about soil management and livestock and the mechanics of farm equipment. And what he didn't know, he helped Eli find out, sending away for agricultural journals from the Kansas State Board of Agriculture and reading them with Eli on winter evenings. Eli had his father's quiet steadiness and his mother's direct intelligence, and Henry treated him always with the respect due a person rather than the condescension common to adults managing children, and Eli responded by becoming, somewhere around age 12, genuinely excellent company. Nora remained devoted to drawing and to horses, and Henry helped her learn to ride copper properly in the summer of 1880, and Ada watched her daughter canter across the field on the back of that patient blood bay, with the particular pride of a parent watching a child discover something they were made to do. Nora had also developed, by this time, the habit of narrating the activities of the chickens in detail to anyone who would listen, giving them individual names and personalities, and tracking their social dynamics with the attention of a natural historian. Warren Peck found this extraordinarily funny and visited more often than his own farm strictly required, so that Nora could update him. James learned to walk in the spring of 1880 with the determined, top-heavy lurching of a small person who has decided upright locomotion is going to happen regardless of physics, and immediately applied his new mobility to attempting to eat everything in the kitchen garden. He was a cheerful and sturdy child with Henry's coloring and Ada's expressions, and he followed Henry everywhere with the total trust and unquestioning devotion that small children have for the people who constitute their world. In the autumn of 1881, Ada told Henry she was expecting again, and this time his response was wordless. He just picked her up and turned with her in the kitchen while she laughed into his shoulder and told him not to drop her, and he said he had never dropped anything important in his life. Their second child, born in the summer of 1882, was a girl. They named her Ruth Margaret for Margaret Holt, who had sent Henry to the farm that April morning 4 years earlier, and who received the honor with moist eyes and a composed expression that fooled absolutely no one. Ruth was a loud, opinionated baby who expressed her needs with the directness of a person who has things to say and wants to say them immediately, and who from her earliest days had opinions about everything, including the arrangement of items on the kitchen table. Margaret Holt came to visit when Ruth was 3 weeks old and sat in Ada's kitchen holding the baby with the practiced ease of a woman who had held many babies, and said, "She'll be interesting," in the tone of a woman who meant it as the highest compliment. The farm by 1882 was thriving in a way that went beyond simply functional. Henry's soil management had increased the Southfield yield to the point that they had expanded the planted acreage by 10, and the egg business Ada had organized supplied 3 establishments in town on a regular basis and produced a steady income through the winter months. The house itself had expanded. Henry and Eli had built a proper second bedroom off the back in the autumn of 1880, and there were plans for a porch extension that would face the south field where the lavender grew. The lavender came back every spring. Every April without fail, the plants along the south wall pushed up their new growth, and by June the whole south side of the house was fragrant and purple-gray and alive with bees. Ada had divided the original plants twice, and they spread along the wall in a long, fragrant border that bloomed reliably, persistently, year after year, exactly as advertised on the small brown paper packet from the general store window in Harlow on a hot August morning 4 years past. Henry had planted lavender. He had planted wheat. He had planted a roof that held through winter and a cold frame for the kitchen garden and a second field rotation and a repaired fence and a rebuilt porch step. And he had planted himself fully, permanently, with both feet in the earth in this place and in this life and in this family. Ada thought about this sometimes when she walked past the lavender in the mornings, the way a perennial works. It doesn't ask permission every spring. It doesn't negotiate the terms of its return. It simply comes back because it is rooted, because the commitment was made once and made completely and needs no annual renewal. The summer of 1883 brought the harvest that Henry would always describe in later years as the best one. Not the biggest. The yield of 1886 would exceed it substantially, but the one where everything came together at once in a way that felt, if you were the sort of person who noticed such things, like a sentence completed. It was a blue sky morning in late July, the wheat in the fields golden and ready, and Ada and Henry stood at the fence together in the early light with James between them. He was nearly 4 now, and had opinions about everything, including the correct way to stand at a fence, and Eli was already in the field walking the rows in the way Henry had taught him, assessing the readiness with a competence that was no longer a young person's imitation, but the real article. Nora was in the barn with Copper's replacement, a young mare she had named Clara with the decisive authority of someone who had been waiting for the opportunity, and Ruth, from somewhere behind the house, was conducting an imperious conversation with the chickens. Ada had her arm through Henry's and his hand was warm over hers, and the sun was coming up over the wheat, and the Kansas sky was doing its extraordinary work of being impossibly large and impossibly blue. "Henry," she said. He said. "I'm glad you didn't just stay until the harvest." He turned his head and looked at her, and she saw in his face the same thing she had been seeing for 5 years now, the attention and the warmth and the steadiness and the particular kind of happiness that a man has when he is exactly where he belongs. "So am I," he said. James, between them, announced that there was a bug on the fence post and that it was very interesting, and the moment broke into the cheerful, ordinary chaos of a morning with small children and a harvest to bring in and a full life to live, and they went to work. The years continued to add themselves, layer by layer, the way soil builds, slowly and with great eventual depth. Eli became, by the time he was 16, indispensable to the farm in ways that would have amazed the 9-year-old boy who had stood at the fence and asked a stranger his name on an April afternoon in 1878. He had Henry's thoroughness and his mother's direct mind, and he had something that was entirely his own, a gift for reading weather and soil conditions that the older farmers in Harlow County came to respect and occasionally to consult. Warren Peck, before his death in the winter of 1884, told Ada that Eli was going to be one of the finest farmers in the county, and Ada had told Eli, and Eli had been visibly moved while pretending very hard not to be. Nora, at 15 in 1886, was tall and serious and passionate about horses, and had developed, in addition to her ongoing animal portraiture, a keen interest in botany that expressed itself in a very organized collection of pressed plants, and a correspondence she had started with a professor at the Kansas State Agricultural College, who had apparently been sufficiently impressed with her questions to respond. Ada read that response letter over Nora's shoulder and felt the specific pride of a parent watching a child exceed what you had been able to imagine for them. James, at 7, was a force of nature in the way that certain children are high energy and bottomless curiosity and enormous warmth, following Henry around the farm with a proprietary attachment and asking questions with the rapid-fire enthusiasm of a person who believes all answers are interesting. He had Henry's eyes, those changeable Creekwater eyes, and Ada's stubbornness, and the combination was, Margaret Holt said regularly, a complete handful and an absolute joy. Ruth, at 4, was managing her household with the composed authority of a senior administrator. She had decided which chair belonged to whom, which way the bread should be cut, and what order things should happen at breakfast, and the family had largely accommodated these decisions because Ruth had a way of looking at you when you deviated from the correct order of things that was both imperious and deeply funny, and because compliance was generally faster than negotiation. In the autumn of 1886, Henry and Ada sat on the porch that had been extended the year before. It now ran the full south length of the house and faced the lavender border and the south field beyond on a cool September evening after the harvest had been brought in and the accounts closed satisfactorily. The children were inside. They could hear Ruth instructing James in the proper way to stack something, and James's cheerful refusal to comply, and the distant sound of Eli reading aloud to Nora from a book of natural history she had received for her birthday. Henry had his arm around Ada, and she was leaning against him in the way she always did, her head against his shoulder, one hand over his where it rested on her arm. The lavender was past its summer flowering but still fragrant in the evening air, the long border of it dark and certain along the wall. 8 years, she said. 8 years, he agreed. She thought about the morning in April of 1878 when he had come out of the gold-pink light and stopped at a respectful distance from the pump and touched the brim of his hat. She thought about the woman she had been then, 31 years old and frightened and determined, carrying 40 acres and a debt and a grief and 2 small children, and the enormous weight of what she was going to do about all of it. She thought about what she would have said if someone had told her that the man at the pump was going to stay. She would not have believed it. She would have thought, people don't stay. Life takes things away. That's what she had learned. But she had learned a different thing. Over 8 years of lavender coming back and harvests brought in and children growing tall and a man who filled the water barrel before she was downstairs and argued about barn roofs because he thought about what would hold through February. Henry, she said. Ada, he said, in the voice he used when he knew she was about to say something he wanted to hear. I'm glad you planted the lavender. He was quiet for a moment. The prairie was making its full evening sound, crickets and wind, and somewhere far off a whippoorwill, and the stars were beginning to assert themselves over the fading blue of the sky. I'm glad the ground was worth planting in, he said. She turned her head and looked at his profile in the evening light, the strong line of it, the jaw that had a few more silver threads in the beard than it had in 1878, the Creekwater eyes tracking something in the middle distance that might have been the field or might have been nothing in particular, just the contented gaze of a man at rest. She reached up and turned his face toward her, her hand along his jaw, and she kissed him there on the south-facing porch with the lavender below them and the prairie dark and wide around the house. And his arm tightened around her and his free hand came up to her face. And it was the same as it had always been and better than it had ever been, the way things are when they have time to deepen. Inside, Eli had apparently resolved whatever issue Ruth and James were having because it was quiet now except for the reading, and the house behind them was warm and full and steady. Ada pulled back and looked at him. "Every harvest," she said. "Every year," he said. "Every single one." She settled back against his shoulder, and they watched the Kansas night arrive in full, with all its extraordinary stars, and the lavender was fragrant on the evening air. And somewhere in the south field the wheat stubble was already composting into the earth, returning to it, readying the soil for what would be planted in the spring, as it had done every year and would continue to do, year after year, in the faithful cycling rhythm of a life rooted completely in what it had chosen and had been chosen by. The children's voices drifted warm from inside the house. The coyotes called from the south. The stars multiplied. And Henry Donovan and Ada Easton, who had both arrived at this life from the long road of loss and necessity, and had found in it each other and had stayed, held on in the good dark, and were home.